Hey folks, and welcome again to another Tech Lead Tips video. This one is about decision making, where we'll go over 5 quick tips to improve both quality and impact of your decision making. So let's dive right in with tip number 1, and that is be aware of cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are something of a shortcuts, or they're like different shortcuts that our brains like to take whenever we're making tough decisions, because making decisions is really intensive and our brains have the tendency to like make it easier on itself and like just take a shortcut here and there. And let's make it a bit concrete. Like what are some examples of cognitive biases? One of the most familiar ones, or the most popular ones, is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is when you look at data which matches with your preferred alternative, or which matches with your worldview. And everything that does not fit into your worldview is like disregarded by your brain. It's not important, but it often is. So that is the confirmation bias. Another famous one is the sunk cost fallacy, which I hear, I think, once a month in my line of work. And that is literally the statement, we have to continue because we already invested so much time and effort in this. And that might not always be the optimal choice. So that is a sunk cost fallacy. And as you can see here, there's like 15, there's a lot more. If you Google cognitive biases, I think there's wiki pages with 50, 100, hundreds of them. But they're all shortcuts, and you should be aware of them. And once you're aware of them, you can factor them into your decision making, and you can call out when it happens in your team, like when people are jumping to conclusions, not taking into account alternative facts, stuff like that. So tip number 1, cognitive biases, be aware of them so you can counter them. Tip number 2 is the wheel of getting stuff, the wheel of getting stuff done. As you can see, it factors in deciding or decision making, but that is only one of 7 steps to get stuff done in your teams. And that's tip number 2. Making a decision is not the only part of the work. There's a lot more that goes into getting stuff done. So let's quickly run through the wheel to provide some context here. It most often starts here on the top with listening. Your team has a lot of great ideas, and your job as a tech lead is to have your feelers out and like spot kernels of an idea, kernels of options that you want to explore with your team. So that is step number 1, listening. Step number 2, clarifying. These kernels of ideas, they're not fully formed yet. Sometimes you have to help pull them out. Sometimes you have to help people make them more concrete, stuff like that. So that's the clarify step. The debate step is where we actually go and talk to people, not unimportant in our job as tech leads, and on who you should consult or who you should talk with when we're making a decision. We'll go more into detail that in like one of the other tips. So, but we should debate. And once we have enough input, we can make an actual decision, we can decide. But the work does not stop there, because we have to persuade everyone involved to actually go with it. Then we have to actually do the thing and implement whatever we wanted to have implemented. And great teams don't stop there. They actually learn from what they just did, and they learn how to decide better in the future. And the wheel spins around and around for another run. So tip number 2, making an actual decision is only a fraction of the work. A lot goes into getting stuff done. Tip number 3, I think it is courtesy Michael Nygaard. We'll see that name again in one of the other tips. But that is what goes into a decision and what is like consequences, comes out of making a decision. And a lot of that people just don't think about often. So that's why it's tip number 3. So let's start with what goes into a decision. You have constraints. Most of the time you have a limited capacity, limited budget, stuff like that. So things that limit your solution space. You have other things that impact your decision, like decisions made in the past, the current software architecture, stuff like that. So you have forces that influence your decision. And in order to make a decision, you need to have alternatives. One thing I would like to add there is If you have only 2 alternatives, that's not enough. What I want to say is you should have at least 3 alternatives if you're making a big life-changing decision or a non-trivial decision. And if you don't have 3 or more alternatives, you probably have not thought hard enough about the problem. So have enough alternatives before you make a decision. Those are all the inputs. What goes out of a decision? Of course, the most important thing, we are deciding something to achieve a certain outcome. So I think that is probably quite evident. But that's not the only thing that comes out of a decision, as you can see. There's this purple bit, and that gets forgotten often, and that's actually pretty important. It's the unintended consequences. So whenever you make a decision, it helps if you give 5 minutes of your thinking time to, but what else might be impacted by this decision? What else could have impact? And maybe those unintended consequences are like a worse outcome, a net negative, once you weigh it in against the desired outcome. So tip number 3, especially think about unintended consequences. Tip number 4 is how I view scaling decision-making power in your teams. Because if you decide everything yourself, you are the bottleneck. Congratulations. So how do you actually scale decision-making? And that's not only by saying, okay, team, you can decide yourself now. That's not a leadership, that's just shirking away responsibility. So what is scaling decision-making? It's giving your team the tools and the processes to actually make qualitative decisions. And one thing that gets used in the software world a lot is called the advice process, which is what I would like to discuss a bit here in tip number 4. So what is the advice process? I think it's often used in software architecture worlds, but you can use it for any kind of decision making. An advice process is basically 3 rules. Rule number 1 is everyone, literally everyone, can make decisions. So everyone can decide for non-trivial things, but they have to follow a certain process, and that is the 2 other parts of the advice process. Number 1 is, or step 2 is, you have to consult people that have constraints, forces, from the previous tip, but also people that are impacted by your decision. So end users or the team, if it's like a decision that affects how the team will have to work in the future, you have to consult those people as well. And step number 3 of the advice process is, once you have consulted with the relevant parties, you actually make a decision, and as a team, you also trust the decision maker that he will do the best job possible given all the inputs he has required. So that is tip number 4. As a tech lead, it's a bit like your job to make the team have decision-making power itself and help them grow in making qualitative decisions. And the advice process can help with that. If this sounds interesting, there's a lot of reading material on the advice process on the Martin Fowler wiki and also on the Teal Organizations or the Reinventing Organizations wiki. There's a lot of reference material for you to dive deeper on stuff like this. And last tip, last but not least, is keep a log of your important decisions. It happens to me or in the past, it happened to me frequently where I looked at my team and said, does anyone remember why we decided to, implement command query responsibility segregation? And everyone's looking at each other and saying, no, I don't remember. That's not a place you want to be in as a team or as a tech lead. So for those important decisions, it helps to document them. One way to do it is with ADRs in the software world. It's an acronym for Architecture Decision Records, but I use documents like this for every non-trivial decision I would like to refer to in the future. And as you can see, you recognize a lot of these terms from one of the previous tips. Like there's a context, there's decisions, there's intended and unintended consequences we thought about. Maybe you can even list the alternatives you investigated, so you don't have to do all the investigating again once you have to revisit a decision. So that's tip number 5. Please document them, and you can use a structured approach like ADRs. So those are my 5 quick tips, and let's give a quick recap. Tip number 1, be aware of those shortcuts our brains tend to use. Be aware of cognitive biases so you can spot them and you can counter them in decision making. Tip number 2, deciding is only part of the process. Remember the wheel of getting stuff done. It takes a lot of steps to actually get stuff done. It takes a lot of preparation, it takes decision making, and it takes a lot of follow-up work after making a decision. Tip number 3, think about what goes into, but especially what comes out of a decision. So not only the intended outcome or the desired outcome, also think 2 minutes about what might be unintended consequences on my team, on the world, stuff like that. Tip number 4 is how you can scale decision making. For example, by using advice process and empowering your team members to make decisions themselves. And tip number 5, last but not least, for non-trivial decisions, keep a record, keep a log. Your future you will thank you. That's my 5 tips on making more qualitative and more impactful decisions. I hope you had fun. See you next time. Bye-bye.